me, it's just a way of being. Right? It's the way I see the world, and I look at something and think, wow, that would make a good story. Or the way that that flower looks in that particular light would be an interesting thing to put in this story. So I guess I have this lens that views the world as a writer, but where that comes from, I don't know.
No?
I can't say where it comes from.
For me, writing is this weird combination of getting all like a strong feeling of connection to a character or a story, and this really almost like falling in love, like this intensity of wanting to know everything about something or someone. And then the result of that is basically hiding from the real world, separating myself from the world, and sitting in my office at my computer and typing things and saying like, husband, son, go away, I'm busy. Which is a really odd way to show your overwhelming love for the world. But somehow that's how it manifests itself sometimes.
It's two things. I think they're two things, but they're connected. But I think basically we are curious about people, and we are observers. Like, who else is going to look at that flower, really, and really think about it that much? But it's our ability to observe, that passion for observing, that makes it so interesting. And I think that we write about it because it's solitary. Yeah, writers I think are in a way are solitary. It's like if we were broadcasters, we would take that information from observing and go speak in public, or we would, painters would take that observation and paint it. But it's our only way of sharing it out is through our thoughts in our head, and I guess also because we like words.
I find it interesting to think about the difference between a writer who observes something and thinks, ooh, I could put that in a story, and say a scientist who observes something deeply and thinks about it deeply and, puts it under a microscope and figures out how it works and that kind of thing. And I think that goes back to the relationship with the imagination, that we observe things and then we think, ooh, that's part of a story. Like we see that the entire world is one big story made up of many, many, many smaller stories, and that when we create stories, we can pull from
I heard someone
a writer interviewed on the CBC who said their creative process, it was like their psyche, I guess, was this big compost heap. Mm-hmm. And that everything in their life that happened to them, yes, they just threw it all in, and it all just sort of rotted in there. and whatever, worms went through it, whatever. But their point was that they often would write about their own experiences or things that were related to their own experiences, but they couldn't do it for about 10 years. That if they had lived in a place 10 years ago, they could write about that place, or if they had an experience 10 years ago, then they could write about it, but that for them it took that time for it all to just kind of turn from individual, orange peels into this rich soil that was the where ideas and thoughts could really grow and come to fruition. And when I heard that, I thought that sounds pretty bang on.
When I think about my relationship with my imagination, I think it's so much more richer and interesting than the real world, which is terrible. But I can remember as a kid living so much in my head that I would go out into the real world and look at people and think, wow, you're really boring. So then I would go home and I would imagine these people, and they would become so much more real and so much more alive in my head than they ever were in the real world. And so I think for me, because I was a fairly shy child, that was how I coped with the real world.
There's the story, there's the reader, so it's this kind of almost triangle. To me, it's more like in the first stage, it's my head, myself, and the story. It's almost like the story maybe isn't out there fully formed, but that there's like this amorphous story dimension or something, and that all I really need to do is get out of the way, like notice things and just sort of start feeling my way into it and letting the story come, and that I'm my own worst enemy. I'm the one who gets in the way, and I have to think, like, stop thinking so much, just let the story come.
I don't find that I'm so much in the way of the story as I don't know where the story comes from. Right, I'll go back and read stuff that I've written before and think, wow, that was pretty good. I don't know where that came from, but apparently I wrote it because it says right there. I think, so when you talk about going from here to the story to the reader, when I'm writing I don't consider the reader at all. I can't, because first of all, it confuses me. I get too concerned about what somebody else might think about it. But I read a quote once, and I can't remember where it was from or what the actual quote is, but the gist of it was, I think they were talking about letters that they had written to somebody. It was that whatever you intended to write on the page, once you've let it go, it's gone, and whatever meaning is interpreted at the other end, you have no control over it. So for me, it's better to just put it on the page and not worry about who's out there.
Because for 20 years of my life or longer, I was a reporter, and you had to go interview the story, interview the subject. You had to come back and you had to write it. You had to write it right then. And I remember my journalism teacher saying something about you have to write it right away because it's like sex. Once it's over with, it's no good. You have to write it right away. And you didn't have the luxury of just, writing a first draft or a second draft. You had to write it and get it done, because then you got to go interview someone else or go to the Burnie
The difficult thing about talking about creativity and about sort of trying to turn the light on creativity is it's almost like creativity or the creative process is this teeming anthill of activity, and there are all kinds of fascinating things going on. But as soon as you actually turn your light on it, it's like all the ants just disappear, and it looks like this barren sand wasteland.
I feel embarrassed to talk about creativity because it assumes that I might have some, and I barely think of myself as a writer. I think since I finished my book, I'm actually thinking of myself more as a writer, and that's so stupid because I've been making a living writing for my whole life. But being a writer, calling yourself a writer, is just sort of highfalutin, Oh, she thinks she's a writer. She thinks she's a princess.
and sometimes it feels like someday somebody's going to come to me and say, okay, prove to me that you wrote this. And like I said earlier, I don't know where it comes from sometimes. And I'll read something and think, wow, I don't really remember writing that. And it's the strangest feeling. Like somebody's going to call me out and say, where did that come from? And because I can't say it came from here, it feels like I'm flawed.
Aren't you waiting for
So,
someone?
for example, I actually brought something tonight for you guys to read.
Yeah.
And I have struggled so much the last couple of days. Both in writing a bit. Okay. Happy Returns, Chapter 1. Alice crouched on the gritty hardwood floor of the bookcase's back office and tore the packing tape off the cardboard box on the floor in front of her. She loved this job. Receiving books, it was called. There was no bare spot on her father's antique oak desk for the packing slip, so she swiveled the chair to face her and set the paper there instead. Then came the fun part. You never knew what you might find in these boxes. The volume on top was Train Your Poodle in 10 Easy Steps. Not the kind of thing her dad would normally stock. Must be a special order. When she scanned the black and white ISBN bars to enter the book into the storage system, the computer...
To me, there always has to have a kernel of experience or a kernel of truth in it, and especially in the character. If you write to please people, you're not doing yourself justice. When it's really good writing like that, you just kind of disappear down that hole, and that's when you come out later and go, did I write that?
Yeah. Great feeling. When you look back on something and you think, I wrote that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's a quarter of it. The other 75% is, oh, that sucks so bad. Oh my God, that sucks. What was I thinking?